Welcome back to Second Chapter Stories, a space dedicated to the profound, often quiet, heroism found in the afternoon and evening of life. Here, we believe that the richest narratives are often discovered not in the frantic opening pages of youth, but in the challenging, luminous chapters written after the age of 50. If you are watching us today, you understand intrinsically that growing older is not a retreat from the world, but an evolution, one that sometimes demands a complete and painful reinvention of self. Stay with us until the very final word of Michael's journey, and you will receive a truth more valuable than any inheritance: that the invaluable skills and the quiet, deep resilience honed over a lifetime are never truly lost, and that purpose, far from fading into the sunset, can be reborn from the deepest adversity and the coldest stone. We will show you, through Michael's unyielding human spirit, how to take the painful, broken remnants of a past life and forge them into the essential, sharp tools for constructing a deeply meaningful new one. This is the indelible and true story of Michael, a man of 58 years, whose existence had been reduced to an uneasy anonymity within the dense, towering structures of Toronto. His personal crisis was not a slow decline, but a swift and utterly unforgiving economic blow. The sudden loss of a 20-year career that led inexorably to financial ruin and finally to the profound desolation of homelessness. Tonight, we trace his desperate, dignified journey from the cold concrete of despair to the warm, focused light of advocacy for his vulnerable peers. Michael's quiet competence, once utilized to manage multi-million-dollar procurement contracts across continents, is now dedicated to the intricate, heartbreaking process of organizing hope for the invisible. Michael's current emotional posture is one of quiet, fiercely held resilience, though it is a determination that will forever be tinged with the lingering, internal chill of the Frost he once knew intimately. The solitude in Michael's small, slightly worn bachelor apartment on the outermost edge of Toronto was not the calm silence of a peaceful home, but the heavy, pressurized quiet of a deep-sea dive. It was October of 2022, and the vibrant life of the city outside was being rapidly surrendered to a persistent, overwhelming steel-gray autumn. For a man whose entire worldview was built on structural certainty, the apartment's walls, painted an indifferent, institutional off-white, were closing in not because of their physical size, but because of the vast, terrifyingly empty future they framed. Michael was a man of routines. For 2 decades, his professional identity had been defined by precise schedules, rigid contracts, and detailed spreadsheets. Now, his life was reduced to an act of desperate, daily arithmetic. Every single expenditure, every penny spent on a coffee or a bus fare, was recorded in a worn, hard-covered ledger. He used the same fine-tipped black ink pen, a remnant from his executive days, to perform this ritual every evening at precisely 7 o'clock. This exercise was not just bookkeeping. It was a vain, almost frantic, attempt to impose order on an accelerating, utterly personal chaos. His severance package and small retirement savings, once a solid, comforting bedrock of self-assurance, were now reduced to a thin, rapidly dissolving layer of sand, slipping away with the inevitability of an hourglass. The quiet erosion of his established life had begun 2 years prior, during the darkest stretches of the pandemic, when a brutal, almost clinical corporate restructuring had taken place. Michael was informed he was redundant, a term that felt less like an HR euphemism and more like the surgical removal of his very identity. He spent months of the subsequent year sending out polished applications into the digital void, carefully tailoring his cover letters to emphasize his experience, only to be met time and again by the standardized, cold indifference of automated rejection notices. The realization that his age was a silent, unwritten veto, an invisible wall of ageism that no negotiation or contract could circumvent, was a devastating blow to his once unshakable spirit. He was an expert in his field, yet the world now saw him only as obsolete. He maintained the facade with a strained, quiet dignity. When forced to speak to his distant adult children or former colleagues, those who inhabited his previous world, he spoke only vaguely of consulting work and taking time off. Pride, that ancient, stubborn armor that had driven his success, became his profound, isolating prison. It was a heavy cloak, successfully insulating him from the shame of admitting his true failure, yet also tragically preventing him from reaching out for the essential social assistance that could have saved him. To ask for help, in Michael's mind, would be to admit the final, terminal failure of his independence, a failure his very core refused to acknowledge. On the 3rd of October, a brightly colored, garishly read legal notice, the final eviction warning, had been slipped under the crack of his door. It was a crude, loud affront to his meticulous sense of order. He picked it up with the detached air of a forensic accountant, placing it carefully on his small desk, not because he was planning to address the deadline, but because its alarming print clashed violently with the muted, controlled tones of his poverty. He did not ignore it out of laziness or irresponsibility. He ignored it out of a deep, furious, and silent defiance. Michael had always solved problems through analysis and procedure. He simply had not yet formulated the correct, step-by-step methodology for dissolving this one. The small apartment, his last foothold, was utterly suffocating, suspended in that tense, brittle calm before the true, devastating storm finally broke. The light of the future, once a clear and beckoning horizon, was now completely extinguished, leaving him isolated and alone in the shadow of his own meticulous despair. The true, devastating break came not with an anticipated clamor, but with the sharp, indifferent, metallic click of the locks being changed. It was a bitterly cold and relentlessly wet November morning in Toronto, the kind of day where the moisture in the air seems to seep directly into the bones. The heavy sky hung low and oppressive, mirroring the crushing internal pressure that had been building silently in Michael's chest for months. The sight of the bailiffs, 2 men, efficient, silent, and utterly devoid of judgment, transformed the abstract concept of fear into a physical, overwhelming, crushing certainty. Eviction, for Michael, was a procedure, enacted with the same dispassionate finality as the corporate decision that had dismissed him. His control, the bedrock of his entire adult life, was shattered in a matter of minutes. He stood numbly on the pavement, the slick, cold concrete a sudden, unwelcome foundation beneath his feet. All he could salvage was a worn, canvas duffel bag. Within it lay the meager remnants of his identity, his essential legal documents, a single, black-and-white photograph of his late wife, and the meticulous budgeting ledger that now served only as a tragic monument to his failure. The key, which he had carried with the same weight and assurance for 15 years, felt suddenly meaningless in his palm. He looked up at the familiar window of his old unit, and it seemed to gaze back at him with the vacant, unblinking stare of a stranger, reflecting the vast, impersonal high-rise towers of the city. With no destination, his movement was, at first, simply an imperative: move. He walked aimlessly, block after block, the duffel bag growing heavier with every meter, the weight a physical burden mirroring the catastrophic weight of his new reality. He found temporary, meager shelter in the transit system and in the perpetual half-light of the few public spaces still open to the indigent. 48 hours later, the internal crisis manifested itself externally and violently. A searing, unfamiliar pain tore through his stomach, combined with a sudden, disorienting fog that clouded the precision of his mind. The crushing stress, combined with weeks of poor diet and sleeplessness, had brought his chronic, undiagnosed prediabetes surging into a critical state. Driven by pure, instinctual desperation, he was forced to seek aid, shuffling into the cold, sterile, fluorescent quiet of a downtown community health clinic. There, a young, tired doctor, whose kindness was constrained by the limits of the system, informed him of the severity of his condition. He needed immediate, ongoing medication to stabilize his blood sugar. Michael nodded, the medical jargon barely registering above the sudden, dizzying wave of vulnerability. He presented his expired, limited corporate insurance card for the prescription refill. When the pharmacist, a woman with weary eyes, returned, she offered only a sympathetic professional shrug. The out-of-pocket price for the necessary medication was an impossible sum, an amount Michael had once spent without a second thought on a single executive lunch or a weekend dry cleaning bill. This was the profound, terrifying epiphany. Not merely the loss of his apartment, but the sudden, horrifying realization that his very physical existence, the functioning of his own heart and mind, was now subject to the same precarious financial conditions that had mercilessly destroyed his career. He felt a chilling betrayal by his own body, which had always been reliable, a silent, disciplined partner in his ordered life. Michael sat frozen on the edge of the examination table, the coarse paper beneath him crinkling with every shallow breath. The low, white noise of the clinic buzzed in his ears, a static lullaby of institutional anxiety. The cold reality of stone, he realized, was not the pavement of the street outside. It was the impenetrable, towering bureaucratic wall separating him from fundamental health and human safety. The last vestiges of denial were utterly gone, replaced by a visceral, shaking dread that vibrated through his entire frame. He was not just broke, he was physically vulnerable, facing a life-threatening reality that no organizational flowchart, no spreadsheet, and no determined procedure could possibly mitigate. Stability, the fundamental bedrock of his 58 years, was revealed, with brutal clarity, to be nothing more than a fragile, fleeting illusion. The long winter had begun, and Michael was stripped bare to face it. The descent into the city's emergency shelters was not a landing, but an assault, a sudden, violent contradiction of Michael's ingrained needs for quietude and structure. These vast, temporary refuges were echoing caverns of human noise, restless movement, and the perpetual, unsettling hum of collective anxiety. For a man who had measured his life in the quiet authority of spreadsheets, the total lack of privacy and the unpredictable rhythms were terrifying. The required schedules were arbitrary and brutal. Wake-ups at 5 o'clock in the morning, lines forming in the pre-dawn darkness for meager meals, the desperate daily search for a secure, functioning locker to guard his few possessions. His organizational mind, once his greatest professional asset, found no logic, no pattern, and therefore no peace in this unrelenting chaos. The shame was a perpetual low-grade fever that burned beneath the surface of his composure. He would sometimes catch his reflection in a passing window, a neatly trimmed beard, a clean, though worn jacket, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, he would see the former procurement manager, the man who had effortlessly commanded respect and negotiated million-dollar terms. The immense, impossible dissonance between that powerful memory and the gaunt man waiting quietly in a food line for a bed was a daily, excruciating torture. This internal conflict became the true war of his winter, a constant, debilitating battle between the heavy pull of self-pity and the sharp, instinctive, lifelong urge to apply his intelligence and fix this impossible, deeply personal situation. He saw himself as a project that had failed. His deepest struggle was to prevent himself from discarding the remaining parts. He began the grueling pilgrimage through what he came to know as the bureaucratic desert. For weeks, his life revolved around the long lines, the faint, stale smell of old coffee, and the sterile, indifferent atmosphere of social service offices scattered across the lower city. The labyrinth of government housing applications was complex enough to defeat a healthy person, and for Michael, already weakened by sickness and sleep deprivation, it was a terrifying gauntlet. He faced forms that required non-existent documentation, or information he had lost during the eviction, and civil servants whose years of exposure to suffering had calcified their exhaustion into a palpable, almost inhuman indifference. Michael, a man whose professional reputation was founded on clarity and communication, found himself defeated by jargon and procedure. He carried his duffel bag everywhere, less like a possession and more like a physical scar, a constant, heavy reminder of the stability he could not account for. The struggle became less about the immediate, physical need for a roof and increasingly about the spiritual, existential fight to reclaim his identity. The system had rendered him utterly invisible. He was a ghost of the stable middle class, too educated to be easily ignored, yet too broken to effectively help himself. He saw young staff members glance at his weary, educated face and quickly look away, unable to reconcile his appearance with his location. He realized the most potent cruelty of homelessness was this anonymity, this reduction to a mere number in a forgotten queue. One bleak afternoon at 3 o'clock, after having been sent to the wrong department across the city for the third time in 48 hours, Michael simply stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk, the sleet turning to a wet snow that dusted his shoulders, and stared at the immense, indifferent towers of Toronto. This city, to which he had contributed decades of work and taxes, now seemed a formidable, unreadable enemy. He was seized by a profound, chilling sense of existential exhaustion. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the greatest difficulty of this experience was not the physical cold that gnawed at his fingers, but the continuous, agonizing fight against becoming utterly lost, a silent, anonymous dissolution into the sheer magnitude of need. His greatest fear was not dying in the cold, but simply ceasing to be Michael. The turning point, the moment the deep, pervasive darkness began to yield, arrived not with any grand illumination or dramatic pronouncement, but in the quiet, dusty corner of the Annex Community Outreach Center's library. It was the heart of the Canadian winter, January of 2023, yet a new, subtle warmth was about to be kindled. Michael had adopted the library not merely as a temporary shelter from the biting cold, but as a silent, unauthorized office. He would sit, his worn coat still damp from the morning's moisture, nursing a single cup of weak, bitter coffee that he had made last for hours. He maintained the pretense of reading the financial news in the provided newspaper, careful to keep his eyes low, maintaining the practiced invisibility that had become his defense mechanism. He was still waiting, still drifting, tethered to the shore only by the fragile hope that his situation was temporary. It was into this isolation that a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the pervasive silence of the reading room, a voice that carried the deep, resonant ring of practical experience. Eleanor, a woman in her late 60s who moved with the kind of efficient, zero-nonsense energy characteristic of those who have spent decades fighting for the overlooked, approached his table. She was a retired social worker, whose professional kindness had been tempered by years of exposure to bureaucratic hardship, rendering her immune to pity. She did not approach Michael with soft words or charity. She approached him with a challenge, a direct, professional acknowledgement of his former self. She carried in her arms an object of profound, chaotic frustration, the center's housing resource binder. It was an overwhelming compilation, a physical relic bound in cheap plastic, bursting at the seams with tape, faded printouts, handwritten notes, and contradictory, often obsolete guidelines. It was, in essence, a map of the very labyrinth that had defeated Michael. "Can you possibly make sense of this mess for me, Michael?" she asked. Her voice neither gentle nor harsh, but simply firm and demanding. Her eyes, shrewd and intelligent, held his gaze, refusing to acknowledge the shame he carried. "They tell me you used to organize things, intricate things, important things. This isn't a problem for another tired volunteer, Michael. This needs a procurement expert." The word expert struck him with the powerful, undeniable force of an electrical shock. It was the first time in over a year, perhaps the first time since the devastating corporate meeting, that his former professional skill, his identity, had been requested, not dismissed. Eleanor wasn't looking at a homeless man, a number in a shelter queue, or a failure. She was looking at Michael, the manager, the man capable of imposing order on complex, hostile data sets. This simple, profound request for his competence was the vital, essential spark. It bypassed his emotional defenses and went straight to the core of what he knew himself to be. He accepted the binder. It was heavy, disorganized, and undeniably frustrating, yet as it settled into his hands, it felt like his first proper assignment in months. He retreated to a small, unused desk, a piece of forgotten furniture stowed away in a dusty back office. This tiny, 4-foot square of stability became his new sanctuary, a command center in his chaotic world. As he opened the binder, the faint, comforting scent of old paper and stale ink filled the air. The familiar weight of professional responsibility settled back onto his shoulders, replacing the crippling, aimless lightness of despair. He began immediately, his fingers, which had grown stiff from inactivity, moving with the slow, deliberate care of a craftsman reclaiming his trade. He started with the basics: section dividers, clean index tabs, the careful transcription of handwritten notes into a unified typeface. It was a painstaking, almost absurd task in the face of his overwhelming, unresolved homelessness. Yet, for the first time since the eviction, Michael felt a profound, satisfying return of purpose, a quiet resonance with the man he had been. He was still Michael the organizer, the analyst, the man who brought clarity to complexity, and the world, or at least a small, dusty corner of it, had given him a new, vital contract. The light had not returned as a blinding sun, but as a tiny, focused beam, illuminating the first step on an impossible path. For the next 2 long months, February and March, Michael lived a dual existence, a dichotomy of shadow and fragile light. By night, he was a silent, intensely guarded resident of the shelter, navigating the low-stakes dangers and the emotional pressure of shared, communal living. By day, he transformed into the earnest architect of hope within the community center, his brow perpetually furrowed in concentration over the sprawling, complex resource binder. He worked with the methodical precision that had once won him major contracts, meticulously categorizing every available housing stream, every ambiguous eligibility criterion, and every disheartening estimated wait time. His organizing project was not just work. It was a desperate act of self-preservation, a way to anchor his mind against the prevailing tide of chaos. Yet, as he mapped the bureaucratic landscape with increasing detail, a chilling, inescapable truth began to emerge. He realized, with the clarity of an analyst solving a difficult equation, that the sheer, overwhelming complexity of the system was not merely an accident of poor design or administrative incompetence. It was, rather, a profound and deliberate feature, a systemic wall of apathy, an agonizing gauntlet designed, consciously or unconsciously, to filter out those without the linguistic skill, the relentless persistence, or the personal advocate necessary to endure it. His detailed organization, he concluded with crushing disappointment, was merely cataloging the heights of a wall too high for most to climb. His theory was immediately and painfully tested when he attempted to apply his newly synthesized knowledge to aid a fellow senior. Her name was Mrs. Rodriguez, a gentle, older woman who had fled a precarious, financially abusive rental situation and was terrified by the prospects of the shelter system. Michael spent 3 full afternoons guiding her, patiently helping her fill out the complex social housing application, double-checking every box and cross-referencing every required document with the exhaustive attention of a professional auditor. He felt a deep, unfamiliar sense of moral responsibility toward her quiet hope. But weeks later, the inevitable, indifferent rejection arrived in the mail. The application was denied due to a single, minor technicality, a missing signature on a supplemental form, an easily remedied error that any functioning human advocate within the bureaucracy could have corrected with a single, simple phone call. The system had rejected not just a piece of paper, but a vulnerable human being. This devastating failure struck Michael with a force harder and more crippling than his own eviction. His personal crisis had been absorbed. This, however, was no longer a matter of personal failure. It was an external war against a broken, uncaring mechanism. The old, familiar despair threatened to creep back into his heart, whispering that order, logic, and meticulous effort were meaningless against institutional indifference and bureaucratic exhaustion. Michael felt a white-hot surge of pure, channeled rage, a powerful, cleansing emotion that was utterly devoid of self-pity. It was a fierce, protective fury on behalf of Mrs. Rodriguez and the countless, voiceless others like her. He finally understood. Organization alone was insufficient to bridge this enormous hostile gap. He could catalog the tools of escape, but he could not force the indifferent gatekeepers to open the gates. He realized, in that moment of profound clarity, that he needed to become more than a cataloger of resources. He needed to be the necessary human bridge, the relentless advocate, the voice that refused to be silenced by procedure. The true conflict had finally begun, and it was outside the confines of his own suffering, demanding his full, uncompromising energy. Frustration, deep and clarifying, crystallized into a furious, focused resolve on a relentlessly gray day in the late spring of 2023. Michael was sitting hunched over a terminal in the community center's public computer lab, a space buzzing with the low, hopeful sound of keyboards clicking and the quiet, persistent breathing of people fighting for a foothold. He stared fixedly at the cold, unforgiving glow of the screen, the rejection letter for Mrs. Rodriguez still burning, metaphorically, a hole through the fabric of his consciousness. It was a tangible piece of evidence confirming his deepest fear, that the system, in its vast, impersonal design, was fundamentally predatory, perfectly engineered not to lift up, but to defeat the vulnerable, precisely because they lacked the resources to fight back. Michael reached a final, necessary, and profound breaking point. It was an internal surrender, but not of despair. It was the complete and final rejection of the self he had been. The old Michael, the victim consumed by debilitating pride and the heavy mantle of shame, was quietly, firmly, and decisively laid to rest. He realized that waiting for a place at the table meant starving. He had to build his own table. He made the definitive, life-altering choice. He would cease being a client, perpetually seeking favor, and become, instead, an unrelenting agent of change. He would use the very specialized tools of his past professional life analysis, flowcharting, procedural clarity to systematically dismantle the invisible barriers of his present condition. He had nothing left to lose, and in that absolute vacuum of security, a fierce, clean, uncompromising power was born. He leveraged a small, anonymous monetary donation he had received, money he could have, and perhaps should have, used for new clothes or better food, to acquire a refurbished, second-hand laptop. This machine, worn and functional, became his new executive desk. He channeled every ounce of the accumulated shame, helplessness, and white-hot fury of the past months into a singular, fierce, focused action. He was going to use his corporate mind to expose and simplify the humanitarian problem. He began meticulously constructing what he branded, with dry administrative precision, as the 58+ network. It was not a plea for charity. It was a manual, an uncompromising guide built for self-reliance. Drawing directly from his decades in procurement, he organized the civic labyrinth into a simple, step-by-step, jargon-free guide and checklist for seniors seeking social housing. He treated the housing system not as a series of bureaucratic hurdles, but as a flawed supply chain, and he provided the essential, missing logistics guide. He named each phase with the dry, authoritative language of his old career, infusing it now with a desperate, urgent need for clarity for those who could not see the way. Phase 1. Document acquisition and verification. Phase 2. Verified submission and tracking. And Phase 3. Follow-up, protocol, and escalation. He rejected self-pity entirely, channeling his trauma into fierce, productive action. He moved, irrevocably, from passively receiving help to actively, powerfully providing it. This relentless focus on service, this outward-facing purpose, finally broke his own personal deadlock. By proving his immense worth to others, he unconsciously provided for himself. The system, once his monolithic adversary, eventually rewarded his determined and knowledgeable navigation. Through the unexpected professional connections he forged while building his network, not begging for help, but organizing it, he secured a spot in a small, supportive co-op transitional housing program. It was not a gift of charity. It was a direct, tangible, and earned result of the system he had learned, through suffering, to both master and fight. He was no longer just surviving. He was building a solid foundation, block by meticulous, intelligent block, for a new life rooted in enduring purpose. The morning sun of autumn 2024 did not merely shine, it poured into Michael's small, functional transitional housing unit. The light was golden, illuminating the slight layer of dust on his simple, sturdy desk. Michael, now 60 years old, stood for a moment, absorbing the profound, quiet sense of place. The unit, with its reliable lock, its small, private mail slot, and a window overlooking the waking city, was more than housing. It was a physical testament to the strength of human will, a profound sanctuary earned through fire. The window framed the vast, challenging skyline of Toronto, but Michael no longer saw an enemy. He saw a landscape of opportunity and a field of work. He was no longer defined by the trauma of his eviction, but by the quiet, formidable power of his advocacy. The 58+ network was growing steadily, a vital organism operated directly from his modest living room. It was connecting dozens of his vulnerable peers with the resources they desperately needed, transforming their terror and confusion into actionable, human-centered steps. Michael had replaced the cold abstraction of corporate procurement with the vital, messy reality of human logistics. He worked closely with Eleanor, their partnership a beautiful, functional blend of his methodical, organizational rigor and her decades of empathetic, on-the-ground social wisdom. He had finally found a new, deep-seated sense of purpose and community, an anchorage far more secure than any salary or job title could ever provide. The arduous emotional journey had culminated in a quiet, necessary reconciliation with his past self. The crushing shame that had consumed him for so long had been systematically replaced by a deep, undeniable dignity, earned through service. He understood that his darkest chapter was not a scar to be hidden, but the crucible that had forged his new strength. He finished updating a client file a triumphant entry for a woman who had just received her keys after an 18-month wait just as the Daily Post arrived. Mixed in with the standard utility bills and flyers was an envelope bearing a familiar, elegant script. It was from his estranged daughter, the one who had drifted away during his years of proud, silent struggle. She had found his name, not through his failure, but through a local news story detailing his work with the 58+ network. Michael held the letter in his hands for a long moment, the faint, heavy scent of the paper recalling a distant, happier past, a time of family, of unspoken assumption, of stability. He slowly and deliberately tore the seal, his finger tracing the clean, straight edge of the paper. His eyes fell upon the first, crucial line. It read, "Dad, I saw what you're doing and I—" He paused, his breath momentarily catching in his throat, the small, profound emotion too immense to articulate. A quiet, resilient smile, the first truly unguarded smile in years, devoid of pretense or pain, spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He lifted his gaze, looking past the letter, and out at the vast, challenging city, which now seemed full of silent potential. He knew, with absolute certainty, that his hardest chapter was finally closed, the book of his suffering sealed and put away. But the story of Michael, the architect of hope, the relentless advocate forged in the fires of adversity, had just begun. There were so many chapters yet to be written, chapters of advocacy, chapters of family, and chapters of purposeful life still waiting for the pen. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey of resilience and second chances. If Michael's unyielding human spirit has inspired you to look for purpose in your own second chapter, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a vital dose of hope, and subscribe to Second Chapter Stories for more moving tales of profound transformation in later life.